back. We are back on the release day. I'm very excited about today because it's the culmination of a long development process, and I'm here with Sarah. She's just about to give birth. So we need to be fast. We need to be fast.
Come on.
Release and baby on the same day.
On the same day. It's the release day.
Release day.
This is it for everything.
So fog day for sure. Yes, today is the release date of Field of Glory Kingdoms, and it's also the celebration of the Field of Glory franchise. As you guys know, last year we had a big day with Field of Glory Medieval mainly, with lots of multiplayer games, miniatures, and lots of other events. And today is Field of Glory Kingdoms. And Sarah?
Yeah, we are really excited. This today is the Field of Glory Day edition 2024. So this year we just concentrate and we focus on the release of Kingdoms. So it will be just a dedicated day for the full franchise, but a little bit of focus and space for Kingdoms. We are really happy finally, Marco, to say that we have released the game, and thanks for all these Slitherine teams and Pocus, of course.
Yeah, of course, yeah. The development team headed by Pocus back in France have done almost, I'd say, I was checking today, Empires released in 2019, plus a DLC, so it's about 4 years of development. Wow. It's quite a lot of time.
Quite a lot of time. So I really hope that you will enjoy the game, but surprises are not finished here. Of course, to celebrate this fantastic day, we have a really nice and awesome, can we say that?
Yeah, absolutely.
An awesome bundle on Fanatical, that is our partnership.
Yeah, Fanatical, if you go on fanatical.com, they are running a super bundle with where you can basically pick and choose your favorite war game in the Field of Glory series, and I think there's some other games in sort of the same sort of type of gameplay, and you can sort of pick 3, 7, and 10 games or something like that for on create your own bundle, and on top of it we have a Masters Edition for Field of Glory Kingdoms.
Yes, on Steam.
Yeah.
So we are running also another bundle on Steam. 20% off Field of Glory Medieval and Kingdoms. So grab your copy there. If you already have the game Field of Glory 2 Medieval, you can just have the discount on Kingdoms. So
that's great.
That's great.
So why are we putting together Kingdoms and Medieval?
Why? Because big hit. I mean, we have already said, but just to focus on that, you can import your battle in Field of Glory 2 Medieval. So that's why. Of course, you can play Kingdoms also if you don't own Field of Glory 2 Medieval, but if you have it, you can just export battles and play on Medieval, and then import the result back on Kingdoms.
So that's pretty awesome. Before we, this is just a small intro. After this, we'll have the proper, event happening. Yep. So we're just here to sell you carpets, basically. But no, the idea here is that the game is the day is structured into sort of several moments, and you sort of find them as we go. The next moment is with two, I would say, friend of ours, and also esteemed historians, Dr. Claire Kennan and Dr. Robert Houghton, who are going to sort of give a bit of sort of historical perspective on the game itself, which is great, because I'm also, in a way, we're trying to sort of break new ground here by releasing a game that's very accurate historically.
Yeah, definitely. We did a lot of research. We have a long history with Robert Houghton and Claire, so happy to have them here and to share their insights and their valuable, let's say, knowledge about history here, and to talk and set about the game.
We were saying earlier that it's crazy that they can talk about all these subjects for a long time without pretending they know stuff like we do every day. So it's pretty cool to listen to them. So I look forward to that. Not to put any pressure on them, absolutely, that's not the case. But anyway, let's take a look at a short, I think 2 minutes video on Field of Glory Kingdoms, and then back to Dr. Kennan and Dr. Houghton here with us.
Thank you.
Field of Glory Kingdoms is a grand strategy game set in 1054, right after the Great Schism, and it spans over 2 centuries of rich history across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. Manage economy, diplomacy, and warfare as you lead one of several hundred nations in a deeply immersive historical simulation. Field of Glory Kingdoms is a deep, historically accurate game with events and mechanics uniquely tailored to each nation. One of the most important features is the authority system. As a ruler, you'll need to maintain control over your realm. Your ability to keep your population and vassals in check is essential for your success. The game also introduces a detailed dynastic system. While you play as a nation rather than a dynasty, planning your succession carefully is still decisive. Religion also plays a pivotal role. Neighboring factions with different beliefs will lead to tensions and, at times, unavoidable wars. Losing too many holy cities could trigger a crusade or jihad, dramatically shifting the game's balance. You'll need to manage your population, from the lowest peasants to the most influential nobles. Presiding the social hierarchy and maintaining control over each class is crucial to ensure stability in your realm. Population is instrumental for production of resources and trade. Protect your borders and build a formidable army with units like knights, sergeants, spearmen, and crossbowmen. You can even fight battles yourself by exporting them to Field of Glory 2 Medieval, and then import the results back into the game. Prepare to dive into a world of epic strategy with Field of Glory Kingdoms.
Hi, thanks very much, Marco and Sarah. I'm Rob Houghton, and as I've just been introduced, I've been working a little bit with Slitherine. I'm a historian of the Middle Ages, but I also do a fair bit of work looking at the way the Middle Ages are represented within computer games and other media. I'm also one of the co-organisers of the Middle Ages in Modern Games conference, which is an annual event. It's an asynchronous conference. You can find us on our webpage, conveniently named middleagesinmoderngames.net. This year we've been very generously sponsored by Slitherine, so please do check out the event. It's going to be going on for the rest of this week, Wednesday, Thursday and Friday. We have events going on basically from 9 in the morning till 9 in the evening. Today, though, I'm here to talk about something much more historical with my friend and colleague, Dr. Claire Kennan, who's a social historian and all-round knowledgeable person about the Middle Ages. And we're going to be talking a bit about some of the key elements that appear within Field of Glory, some of the key historical issues surrounding the game, and perhaps some of the key misconceptions that we see in a lot of popular representations of the Middle Ages. I suppose if we get started, Claire, because I know one of the big areas of expertise is all about medicine within society. And I suppose one of the big things when we're looking at the Middle Ages in computer games or in any sort of modern media is medicine's always presented as something that's very backwards. Get use of leeches, maybe a bucket of leeches to cure what ails you. There's a reliance on superstition and perhaps some ill-advised surgery going on. So was that really the case? What was medicine like in the Middle Ages?
So there is certainly some truth in what you're saying there, Rob. It's really important when we're thinking about medieval medicine to understand that it's actually coming from a very long tradition that's come directly out of ancient Greece and Rome. And there's still influences of people like Galen and Hippocrates. And the idea for medieval medicine is based on humoral theory, so that the human body is made up of 4 different humours, blood, black bile, yellow bile, and phlegm. And if these were out of balance, you would become ill. So to get them back into balance, you needed to regulate the 4 humours through things like exercise, diet, and evacuation. And this is where the bucket of leeches comes in, because bleeding people was a really popular method in the Middle Ages of getting that excess blood, which might cause you to become sanguine, out of the body. So yes, bucket of leeches, absolutely. And you mentioned sort of some ill-advised surgery, and again, yes, that's very true. In the Middle Ages, it's very much physicians who have the university education, but they're only available to the very rich. They cost a lot of money. So if you had something like a gangrenous limb that you needed cut off, you would go to someone who practiced as a barber surgeon, and they're called barber surgeons exactly because that was their other profession. They were often barbers, people who were used to using tools, perhaps people who worked in the butchery trade. You know, if you had a cataract, you might go to a tailor who's very good with a needle and thread. So surgery is often a last resort. Obviously, infection's a big issue as well. We haven't got good germ theory yet. So there are equal doses of sort of humoral theory, some practical elements, but also as well the spiritual that you mentioned. So yes, the church is important. You could pray for good health. You could go on pilgrimage to a saint's shrine, but also astrology, kind of looking at the planets and their alignments, and seeing kind of, you know, when you were born and how this might influence your health or your ill health. So it all plays a part in medieval medicine.
It's really interesting with this this combination, I suppose, of these various very practical methods for reliant on going down to the butcher to have your hand removed whilst you pick up a pound of sausages, perhaps. But also this link back to ancient history, to ancient medicine. I suppose in many respects we can blame the Greeks for a lot of the medieval approaches to medicine. Could you tell us a bit more about the role of the church here? Because we saw in the video just now, religion is a key part of the Middle Ages, certainly in the popular imagination. I know it's a key part of Field of Glory Kingdoms. Does the church act as a hindrance or a help to medieval medicine? Because obviously the church is often connected with healing houses, but at the same time, the Christian church in particular is very often presented as holding back science. So
absolutely. There is this perception that the medieval church holds back science and technological development, and that's not necessarily true. So the monasteries were actually key repositories of information. That's where a lot of these medical texts are gathered. They're translated from Arabic into Latin, and they're really sort of centres of learning. They're also the site of the early hospitals. So most monasteries would have a hospital attached. They're much broader than our understanding of a hospital today. So yes, you could go to the infirmary and be treated if you were ill, but also if you were a travelling pilgrim or a merchant and you needed somewhere to stay, you would go to the hospital attached to the monastery. It means very much hospitality in this sense. We also tend to think that the church had issues with some of the scientific developments. So when we get the rise of universities, the earliest, you know, some of which were in Italy, Bologna springs to mind, dissection does come onto the curricula in around the 14th century, but the church doesn't really get too involved. It doesn't sort of, you know, ban it outright. And in some cases, it actually asks for dissections, because if you're trying to determine whether or not a dead person is a saint, you actually need to have a poke around in the body and see what's going on and whether or not they're decaying. So, no, I wouldn't say the church completely holds back medical advancements, but there is constantly throughout the Middle Ages this tension between the secular and the sacred. And again, that's something that really comes out in Field of Glory as well.
Brilliant. And that's really interesting. I was talking about universities, because of course if the universities, they're founded by papal bull. So the Pope has to approve the university, and of course the main things that are taught there, so yes, theology, but also medicine. So I think it's really interesting, there's this really strong connection between the church and medical practice, and I suppose in science more generally.
Absolutely.
Something that we really ought to talk about, because it's one of my favourite social history subjects, and it lets me ask about a particular topic here. The Middle Ages, they're pretty much synonymous with dirty peasants. So if we've seen anything from Monty Python through to Game of Thrones, the vast majority of the population are the great unwashed masses. And we get this idea that they've got this really poor concept of hygiene. You never wash your hands, much less anything else. Is that really the case? Would the population have had any idea about hygiene? Was this a cause of the spread of disease, things like the Black Death or anything else?
Yes, so you're quite right. There is this misconception that in the Middle Ages people were really dirty and unhygienic, and certainly by modern standards, you know, yes, that was true. They wouldn't have, you know, deodorant and access to showers and you know, fresh hot water, for example. But again, we need to put ourselves into the medieval mindset to think about this, because you mentioned the Black Death, which is, you know, a huge pandemic that hits all over Europe and the wider world. If you believe, as medieval people do, that, you know, it's caused by this miasma, this bad air, the corruption of the air that's spread from person to person, then the last thing you're going to want to do is take a bath Because if you have a bath in hot water, that opens the pores up on your skin, that will allow the miasma into your body and infect you with disease. So when you think about it in those terms, actually, it makes sense. And I think that's what's really important. We need to remember that these are people who aren't working with germ theory. They are very much working with humoral theory, with the idea of the planets and things being aligned spiritually. So that's very important, and that does influence what we see. The other important thing as well to note is that peasants wouldn't have had access to physicians. They're very expensive. So they would have had to go to local apothecaries. They would have dealt with natural remedies, with herbs. Often herbalists were women, which is really interesting. We see and some interesting links to witchcraft there. But yeah, it's not as straightforward as we might think. And certainly in city-states like the ones in Italy, there are public health measures in place. So of course people are concerned with health and hygiene. You know, quarantine is introduced for the first time in the Italian city-states when the Black Death breaks out. And in London we have things like the assize of nuisance, where people complain about, you know, so-and-so's latrine next door not being properly constructed. So people do care about health and hygiene. It is at the forefront of the medieval mind, but it's working within a different sort of framework to what we have today.
I think this is a really important thing when we talk about people in the Middle Ages. We're thinking about them being superstitious or backwards. A lot of the time, just like you're saying, they're thinking things through. They've got a form of logic. They've just not necessarily got the right starting point for that. And again, we can blame the Greeks, can't we? But, and it's really interesting what you're saying about the role of women within medicine and all these natural remedies. And I think some of them do sort of work. But this takes us on to one of the big questions, really. So, saying on the subject of dirty peasants, would the majority of the population have had access to medicines, or would they have just been too expensive or too reliant on local cures?
So they really wouldn't have had access to a physician at all. I mean, it's important in the Middle Ages to remember that 90% of the population would have been agricultural workers, so living and working in a rural community. And they just simply wouldn't have had the funds or the resources. And what we see in Western Europe is that a lot of the peasantry actually are tied very strictly to their lords, and they owed them things like either financial payments or labour services. So they quite often had little say over how they would spend their income, if they had any, how they would use their resources. So I think, no, there's very limited access to that level of medicine, and it would have been a case of local cures, local knowledge, local herbalists, definitely.
And that's really interesting, as well as this view of, well, this system of medieval society. And I suspect many of the viewers will be familiar with the concept of the feudal system. The king sat on the top with his nobles beneath him, the knights beneath them, and then the vast majority of the population, just these peasants, these very poor, very impoverished individuals. I mean, is that a useful model for the period? Is it particularly universal? Are there different things happening in, say, the Middle East or Scandinavia?
So that's really interesting. The feudal system, I should start by saying, is actually hotly debated among historians, whether it existed or not, or what we call it, and, you know, was it really this kind of strict structure that's like a triangle, or was it messier? There's certainly a system of power holding where land is sort of parcelled out to those below you in return for money or military service or labour dues. And at the very bottom, yes, you do have the majority of people who are the peasants, the serfs. And if you're a free peasant, then you've got a little bit more say over what you do with your life and, you know, whether you move from area to area. If you're an unfree peasant, though, actually you have to get your lord's permission to do anything. So if you want to, you know, marry someone who lives in the adjoining field, or you want to, I don't know, inherit the land from your father, you have to have your lord's permission. And so there's quite a lot of interference in the private lives of these individuals as well. If we look to the Middle East, so if you think modern day Egypt and Syria, there is a similar sort of landholding system known as the Iqtar, but that's much more based on taxation, and there's much less interference with the lives of the ordinary people who are sort of living on the land. And again, if we look to Scandinavia, of course, we've got the thralls, who are essentially slaves. And of course, we need to remember that in the Middle Ages, below the free and the unfree peasantry is another social class, and those are the slaves. And in the Middle Ages, it is predominantly Europeans, often captured during war, who are traded as slaves, generally from the Slavic regions, so that's where the terminology comes from. And in Scandinavia, slaves really form an important part of the economy because they're used for vast building projects. The Vikings are obviously expanding their kingdoms, and slaves really form the basis of this, but they have very few rights. They're essentially treated, like other animals like cattle. They often share the same space as those animals. There were options to get out of slavery. You could buy your way out with the agreement of your lord, but again, it's quite tricky to do. So medieval society is very differently structured to sort of what we're used to, and it is very hierarchical, whether or not we use this feudal pyramid as the system we discuss, or something else.
Brilliant. Well, not brilliant, especially if you're a serf, if you're a slave. It sounds very much like, for the vast majority of the population, for the vast majority of men, things were really pretty rough. If you can't move about, if you can't get married, inherit without the permission of your lord, your master, and so forth. I suspect I've got an inkling about the answer to this question, but if things were that bad for most men, how were they for women?
So this is interesting. Yes, similarly to men, most women lived and worked in rural communities. So we would see them engaging in things like sort of agricultural labour, being involved in the harvest, but also some other sort of cottage industries, things like brewing beer. That was very much, part of what rural women did. But then on top of this, they've got all the domestic responsibilities, looking after the household, looking after the children. It's a slightly different image in towns because women could be involved in certain crafts and trades, they could become apprentices, they could work their way up and run their own workshop. We have examples of women, as sort of bell founders, merchants, silk weavers, so a few more opportunities, but on the whole, it's pretty restricted. I mean, if you were a noble woman or a royal woman, you might have more time available to yourself. I mean, we've got an image on screen at the moment of Christine de Pizan, who's very famous as a medieval female writer. But that experience, it's not normal. It's not the average experience of a medieval woman. And ultimately, royal and noble women were there to be baby-making machines. That was their role. We do have another interesting option for women in the Middle Ages, which is to take the veil or to become a nun. And of course that opened up different avenues in terms of access to education and libraries. And there was a sense that you really could sort of have ownership of your own life because you could work your way up to being an abbess and perhaps run your own nunnery and have sort of power locally. So there are some interesting avenues that women could take, but again, most of the population, men and women, were peasants.
Again, that's really interesting. So we've seen this very restrictive society. That once, very, very key avenue of way to get around that is perhaps through the church. We're back to religion all over again. So we've been talking a lot about social history, but we're here to talk about Field of Glory kingdoms. So I suspect we really ought to get on and talk about some of the key aspects of medieval military. And if we're talking about warfare in the Middle Ages, there are basically two things really that we need to cover, I think, aren't there? So we need to talk about castles and we need to talk about knights. And to start with then, so if we're going to talk about castles, because they show up in all sorts of medieval media, you can't really see a film without some glorious castle being sat in the corner, potentially undergoing a glorious assault at some point. And in fact, these are pretty pivotal in Field of Glory kingdoms. So are these structures, are they purely military things, or do they have any other function within medieval society?
So absolutely, castles are military structures, and we've got a great example on screen, which is Crac de Chevalier, which is obviously the very famous Crusader castle. And you can see that it's heavily fortified. It's got a really strong keep in the centre, it's surrounded by tall walls, it's got lots of fortifications. I mean, if you approached that would be a challenge to sort of, capture it. But as well as having, this military purpose, castles absolutely have a social function too, because you would have a lord or a noble who lived there, and the castle really allowed them to sort of carry out their social obligations. So whether that is entertaining other local lords or royalty, or dispensing justice, they would hold courts there to kind of listen to local people's legal cases. They're also an important centre for crafts and trades that they had to trade with the local countryside to have all the supplies that they needed. If you look at how fortified they are as well, they're a great place to keep important documents and money that you'd collect through taxation. So castles did have multiple roles that were important both in military terms, but also socially as well for the local communities.
Brilliant. And just looking at the castle we've got up here, it's remarkably similar to a lot of the castles we see around Wales, a few other places around the British Isles, and I suppose this really speaks to a connection between what we see on Crusade, what we see back in Western Europe. So looking at this though, it's a castle with various elements attached to it, so it's not just a military centre, it's an economic centre and so forth, but it's pretty formidable. So how would you go about taking a castle like this?
Yeah, I mean, if we look at that structure, you've got three options. You could go over those walls. I mean, if you approach them, they're incredibly tall, and that might be quite difficult. But you could put ladders up against them. You could send your men up and over. So that's one option. Another option is that you can actually tunnel underneath the castle walls. I should point out that obviously mining was a dangerous activity in the Middle Ages, as it remains so today. But there are great stories of, for example, the English king, King John, tunnelling under castle walls, sending pigs in and then setting light to them so that that caused a huge explosion and you gained the castle that way. But increasingly, with technological developments in the Middle Ages, we see armies actually just trying to literally smash through those castle walls because, of course, another thing that's very synonymous with the Middle Ages is things like siege engines. And the really important one that we see emerging is the counterweight trebuchet. And this has been around actually for quite a long time in Western Europe, but also in the Far East. In China, it's recorded in about the 4th century. And we've got a great example on screen now, and you can see that what this did, using that counterweight system, it allowed you to hurl bigger, larger, heavier missiles over greater distances. So it really was effective in smashing through a castle's defences. However, if you are the attacking army, you've got to think, well, if we win the castle and we cause all this damage by smashing through its walls, to then secure it so that we can have the castle, that's going to take a lot of resource. You're going to need, all of your different builders and stone cutters and other workers, and you're going to have the financial resources to fund a big project like that. So there's pros and cons to that approach, definitely.
So I suppose then, so some very complex, very innovative tactics being used to get inside the walls of these massive fortifications. But if we look at pitched battles in any sort of medieval media, I'm looking at you here, Game of Thrones, where it will just be a mob of men on either side will run towards each other and there'll essentially be a massive brawl in the middle. Was that the extent of medieval strategy? And how does that fit in with our concepts of knights in shining armour? Because it seems very, very distinct, this dirty, dirty brawl combined with chivalric knights and heroes.
I mean, absolutely, of course there would have been, these kind of scuffles and these brawls, certainly. But generally, sort of with the emergence of the knightly classes, we do see chivalric codes of honour coming into play a lot more. So a knight, in medieval terms, is basically a soldier in armour on horseback. And he sort of added to the ranks that already existed of infantrymen, of archers, of crossbowmen. But what happens in the High Middle Ages, so sort of that period between 1100 and 1300, is that knights emerge as their own distinct social class. Now, there's practical reasons for this, because to pay for a horse and your own armour, which you had to do, you had to have a certain amount of wealth. So you had to have a certain amount of land to actually become a knight. And so they emerge as this very distinct group in the Middle Ages. And with that comes this code of honour, the chivalric code. And within a pitched battle, for example, if you caught a nobleman or another high-ranking knight, you couldn't just murder him in a really bloody way on the battlefield. Actually, you took him hostage. It was part of this code of honour, and then you would then discuss ransoms and things like that at a later stage. The other thing as well is that medieval armies didn't fight all year round. As you can see from the image we've got on screen, which is a very famous medieval battle, the Battle of Crécy. Most battles, you didn't want them to happen in the pouring rain or in the snow and in the middle of a storm, because practically that would have just caused too many problems. So there are actually agreed seasons for fighting, and there is almost this kind of, this understanding between nations that, okay, we're at war, but we're going to go to battle at these specific points in the year when we both stand a fair chance. So it's a really interesting development, and it's certainly one that's resonated to the present day. As you said, the idea of the knight in his shining armour arriving on horseback to rescue people.
It's a really interesting combination, really. So there's this very brutal warfare that we see in this idea of romantic chivalry, but romantic chivalry being so self-serving. So certainly you're capturing your opponent because you can ransom them, but at the same time, well, you want to capture your opponent because then if you get captured, then you might be treated a little bit better. You might survive. I mean, it's really quite cynical, I suppose. Moving on a little bit, because we've talked about castles, we've talked about a few technological developments about how they were constructed, and a little bit about how knights were armoured, how they were paid for it. But castles aren't the only big structures of the Middle Ages. If we walk around any medieval town, any medieval city, somewhere like Milan, you can hardly move without coming across churches, cathedrals, all these massive religious structures. So why do we see so many of these churches and cathedrals appearing during the Middle Ages, and how are they constructed?
So yeah, you're so right. The church is hugely important in the Middle Ages, and it's great that that's represented so well in Field of Glory. Cathedral building in particular, as well as sort of building a local parish church, was one way that you could ensure that you would earn these kind of bonus points to get through purgatory much more quickly and make it to heaven, which was the goal. You were always thinking about your afterlife rather than your present life. That was the important thing. And in the Middle Ages, we've got a culmination of things. We've got increasing wealth, particularly in that period leading up to the Black Death in the mid-14th century. You've also got a lot of creative energy. So the example we can see on screen now is actually a great example of Gothic architecture, those lovely pointed arches, those very tall walls where you could put lovely stained glass windows. And the whole idea, the reason that medieval cathedrals are so huge is because when you're inside, it casts your thoughts upwards towards God and the heavens, and it sort of encourages that spiritual contemplation. But as you say, they are absolute feats of architecture. They are we look at them today and it's, how are they built? Well, there's a lot of practical considerations. So yes, you needed a lot of money. They also took a long time. So if you donate to a building project or if you're involved in its design, you are probably not going to see its conclusion in your lifetime. So there's definitely a sense that it's something that goes beyond you and your mortal life. At the centre of a building project like this, you would have had a master mason who would have overseen everything and the designs. You then, below him, would have had sort of your regular masons who are heavily involved in the construction work. Stone cutters. Often a lot of the cutting and dressing of stone happens elsewhere, and things are transported onto site using such great inventions as the wheelbarrow. That's really important. And in this period, in the Middle Ages, we do see the emergence of guilds, who are essentially sort of groups of workers who are trying to protect their rights, their conditions of work, standards of work, pay and apprenticeship. And so they would have also been very heavily involved in these construction projects. And just as we see in other areas, there are great technological advancements as well that really help with the construction of these huge buildings. And a particular favourite of mine is the tread wheel crane, which actually allows you to move these huge and heavy sort of pieces of stone to where you need them. So you'd have your scaffolding constructed, and then, as you can see on screen now, it's a bit like a giant hamster wheel. You'd have some poor soul kind of plodding around, and that would be used to hoist these pieces of stone up. So there's a lot of technological advancements that allow for the building of these structures. There's a lot of creative energy, but also, there's the wealth and the power. And really, if you want to do well in the medieval world, you need to have God on side, and to do that, you need to have the Pope on side, and building a cathedral is really a great way to please the Pope.
So the higher the spire, the closer to God.
Absolutely.
Very much.
Yeah.
And this is really interesting because we see cathedrals everywhere within medieval media, whether it's film or TV or what have you. But we very rarely really look at how the things are constructed, and again, the role of religion in developing mechanical techniques, developing, like you say, science. So we've talked a bit about castles and cathedrals, but maybe looking at some more practical buildings, because a lot of the time when we think about the Middle Ages, we maybe think about, well, we've talked about poor hygiene, we maybe think about people not necessarily consuming water because the water's dirty, but people like to drink things. So were people in the Middle Ages able to access cleanish water, and how would they go about doing that?
Yeah, so I think clean-ish water is the important thing here. So if we kind of look back to ancient Rome, they had a vast network of aqueducts which brought clean water into the city. Unfortunately, with the fall of the empire, a lot of these aqueducts are destroyed, and that's simply through sort of, going into disrepair, not having the infrastructure in place. And of course, with the so-called barbarian invasions, some of these aqueducts are destroyed deliberately. It's a siege tactic that, cutting off the supplies to the town so that you can conquer them. And in the Middle Ages, some aqueducts are repaired, but increasingly what we actually see is sort of wells being sort of constructed and supplying the local population with water. And again, one of the great places to look for these systems is the monasteries. They have excellent sort of wells that feed into conduits, and so you've got fresh water being supplied to things like the bathhouses and the kitchen and the brewery, and then it exits the complex via the latrine. So again, there is this concern with health and sort of not messing up your fresh water with your wastewater. But you're quite right, people needed access to water, but also people did drink a lot of small beer and things like that because they understood that not all water was good for them. I should say that small beer is not the kind of beer we'd have today. It's it comes from a much later stage of the brewing process, so it's a lot weaker. But water also does have a lot of spiritual qualities. You're baptized in holy water. For curing certain ailments, you would drink water from certain religious spaces. So again, we do see the sacred kind of infiltrating secular concerns and even things like town planning and practical elements.
Brilliant. So once again then we're seeing the influence of the church, influence of religion within all these various different aspects of medieval culture, medieval society and so forth. I suppose if we think about the Middle Ages in popular culture though, it's really European. And this is something that's, I feel, was probably a bit of a misrepresentation because, well, Europe doesn't exist in a vacuum. Europe never exists in a vacuum. Field of Glory Kingdoms, I'm glad to say, goes in a different direction. We're seeing plenty of representation of North Africa, the Middle East, and further afield. So how do we, so Field of Glory also places a pretty heavy emphasis on maritime exploration. So how do we go about this sort of maritime exploration? Because a lot of the societies we've been talking about, these kingdoms, they don't really have standing navies. They don't really have the same sort of centralised bureaucracy to organise expeditions of discovery. So how does exploration take place? Who's driving it? What's driving it?
That's a really great thing to think about. So as you say, the world is much more connected than we often think with the Middle Ages. For centuries, the Silk Roads, or more accurately, the Silk Routes, because they weren't all roads across land, connected Europe with the wider world through trade. And it's really trade that pushes maritime exploration. As you say, most of these nations don't actually have navies per se. The one exception is the Byzantine Empire, but I'll come back to that one. So really what we see in the Middle Ages early on is the use of sort of militias, essentially, to control areas of the sea. So those are used for expansion. The example we've got on screen at the moment is, of course, some lovely Viking longboats, which are very well known in sort of medieval imagery. But they were also used for trading as well, and that's really when we see the change in technology and in shipping. So if you think about a Viking longboat, it's clinker built, so that means that it's kind of the planks are laid one across the other. And that's great because they're very maneuverable. You can use them to quickly whiz up and down rivers and conquer territories as the Vikings did. But if you want to start trading, you're going to need storage space for your goods. And also as well, as kingdoms start to expand and they want to build empires, you need to be able to put weapons on board and also men as well to fight. So this leads to developments which allow for much bigger ships, such as cog ships. And these are carvel built, so they've got the planks next to each other, and that allows for much greater storage space. And what we see really is certain kingdoms, certain principalities, start to develop navies as they become more powerful, as they have more wealth, so they can build these bigger ships, they can keep them equipped. And one great example we have actually is Venice. So the Venice arsenal actually becomes one of the biggest pre-industrial armories and shipyards in the medieval world, and they really take their cue from the Byzantine navy, which is the one place where kind of the earlier Roman navy doesn't sort of fall out of favour. It remains, and it provides a bit of a blueprint that's then replicated across Europe. And the connectivity we can see, you've got, not just the spread of goods and sort of exchange and trade, but also the spread of ideas. And so we see shipbuilding sort of influences, quite far away. So in Genoa, we have the Carack, which is, a really famous ship design, and that then influences northern shipbuilding. So maritime exploration is great for trade, it's great for, expanding your territory, but also for spreading ideas. So the medieval world is much more connected than we sometimes think.
I suppose it's these things, or figures like Marco Polo or Ibn Battuta, these travellers who go across these vast distances to China, to Indonesia, and a lot of it's based around trade. So we're talking about Venice, about Genoa. They just decide, well, they need to build a bigger boat because they need to transport more goods. And it's really interesting to hear how this all becomes a bit more formalised, a bit more permanent almost. But with all these people going around on the oceans, I mean, the sea is still really dangerous. How do people view the ocean in the Middle Ages? Is it a bit of superstition here? Is it very much full-blown here be dragons territory?
I mean, there's certainly a mystery to the ocean, and I think that's something that persists today. The ocean remains one of the great unexplored expanses on our planet. So, the fact that it's always changing, it's always moving, you've got tides, you've got sort of weather extremes, it did seem like a mysterious entity in the Middle Ages. And I think it's fair to say that most people would feel, slightly unnerved by being out of the sight of land. And when you sort of add to this the belief in various mythical creatures in existence in the oceans, we can really understand that. We've got a great illustration on screen which actually shows some of the creatures that people believed existed in the oceans. And some of them actually might look quite familiar to land animals, and that's because, taking again their cue from the ancients and classical civilizations, medieval people believed that for every land animal there was an equivalent in the ocean. So you had things like sea dogs, sea lions, and sea lions do exist, just not sort of the way that medieval people pictured them. So it is a vast and it is a mysterious place. But again, with advances in technology, people become more confident with navigating the sea. So this is the period when we get the sort of early magnetic compasses being invented and being used. Navigation charts, which relied quite heavily on the stars and the position of the moon, allow medieval people to explore the oceans with greater confidence.
That's incredible. So I was going to ask about the technological developments, because we've talked about bigger boats. We just mentioned compasses, mentioned star charts, so people are more capable of travelling further, more predictably. But this, I suppose, this ties in very neatly with some other aspects of medieval thinking, because we keep talking about religion and its impact on medicine, on thought and so forth, but medieval people, they're not just concerned with the physical world, are they? Because, well, possibly tied to this element of religion, there's a lot of metaphysical aspects, considerations of the cosmos, of the world beyond the earth, up into the heavens and so forth. So could you tell us a bit about the medieval view of the cosmos? What was out there?
Absolutely. So when we were discussing medicine earlier, we were saying, that the position of the planets and the stars was very important in medieval diagnosis. It could affect everything from the personality of a newborn baby to whether or not you should go ahead with a medical procedure. And actually, by the 1500s, in many European countries, it was actually a legal requirement for physicians to consult the position of the stars and the moon and what's going on in the cosmos before they carried out certain complicated procedures. And they would often carry around sort of almanacs or very beautiful illustrated calendars like the one that we're showing now to help them do that. And I think what's important in understanding the medieval worldview is that the relationship between the sacred and the secular is much more porous. It's not so clear-cut. There are lots of things that are influencing their decision-making. And you're quite right that they looked at the physical world around them that they could see, but they also considered the things in the heavens, the things they couldn't see, the things in the celestial sphere. And that was just as important in influencing their decisions. And really this feeds into lots of areas of medieval life. So yes, health, but also sort of politics and military strategy. Some emperors, the Holy Roman Emperor is a great example, had an official astronomer who would guide him on whether or not now is a good time to picture a battle or not. So it's a really interesting thing to think about. But yeah, absolutely, this consideration with the world beyond what we can see is a key thing in the Middle Ages.
I really like this connection you're drawing here, and particularly this idea that if, say, Mercury is in retrograde, then maybe you put your appendectomy off for another week or so. And yes, this guy that you were saying with these emperors, it's Frederick II, the German emperor, is also ruler of Sicily. He's got a load of very interesting, very logical ideas, but things that, again, they're coming from very different first principles. They don't necessarily ultimately make sense, but every step of the logic does work. And I think it's really interesting how we've seen right the way through everything we've been talking about today, some of these misnomers, some of these misconceptions that medieval people perhaps have about the world. And perhaps we start to see, well, some connection with a lot of fantasy fiction. So we're intimately connected with the Middle Ages is all these ideas about magic, about cosmology, about alchemy. So can you tell us a bit more about alchemy in particular? How is that based in medieval reality?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got a lovely image on screen now of an alchemical text, which is a great example of some of the things that were being produced in the Middle Ages. So alchemy is really concerned with two things. So namely turning base metals into pure gold and silver, but also hunting down the elusive philosopher's stone to give eternal life. And that's really what people practicing alchemy are trying to find. What's interesting is that alchemy isn't ever officially on any university curricula, so it remains largely unregulated. Now, of course, that means there can be lots of charlatans practicing alchemy, but actually it's quite interesting because it means that it's open to a lot more people, it's accessible to a lot more people. So we do see a lot of women engaging in, alchemical research as well. There's a lot of crossover between alchemy and medicine. So again, this is a great example of where we see that kind of the spiritual realm, the mystical realm influencing something more secular. And we see that kind of transmission of ideas and knowledge between the two fields. So in medicine, there are certain sort of alchemical practices that are used, certain techniques, certain metals that are incorporated into cures, and then vice versa. So things from the medical realm, bodily fluids is a really, big one, as well as human hair and things like that, being incorporated into alchemical recipes. And I think this is really my takeaway message for trying to understand the medieval world and the world of Field of Glory, is that it's not as clear-cut as perhaps we would understand it today in the 21st century, and there is a lot more movement between the secular and the sacred, and that's an ongoing tension that medieval people felt.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, Claire. And I think absolutely the Middle Ages is a strange and often wonderful place, but there's plenty to explore. So that's everything for our session just here, talking about history and its connections to some of the elements you'll find in Field of Glory. If you'd like to hear about some more elements of medieval history attached to modern games of all varieties, then please do check out the Middle Ages in Modern Games over on our website, again, very generously sponsored by Slitherine. We're going to go to a video, and then we're going to move over and talk, some of the developers are going to talk about Field of Glory Kingdoms. So thank you, Claire.
Thank you very much, Rob.
What a wonderful presentation and deep dive in history that was. I'm Alberto, and I'm here with Neil, and we are going to deep dive ourselves, but in the game itself, Field of Glory Kingdoms. So, Neil, it's been a long journey.
It has been a long journey. I think it was 2 years ago when we were in Venice that we first announced the game, and an awful lot of work has taken place since then, certainly. A lot of that work has gone into making the major factions in the game all play uniquely, so that there's a lot of custom content. In our previous game, Fog Empires, it was only really Rome that had a large amount of custom content. This time we have a dozen major nations that have completely different gameplay styles from each other, as well as many minor nations on top of that. So creating content to make all of these factions play differently has been what we've been spending a lot of the last 2 years. I mean, indeed, a lot more than 2 years. It's 2 years since we first spoke about it, but a lot longer in the making.
Yeah, and well spoken, because our first topic of the day, in fact, covers unique countries and how uniquely they play, the unique flavor they get. So we have a first clip that we want to show you. It's the first of the 3 examples that we want to show you. It's about the Byzantine Empire.
Indeed. So obviously one of the best known territories of that age. We can see in front of us a map that is full of red. The Byzantine Empire is enormous compared to any of the other major factions.
It's probably the largest faction at the game start, right?
Oh, without doubt, yes. It's so much bigger than anywhere else worth playing, certainly. However, a thing we will come back to many times today is that every advantage that Kingdoms gives you comes with a disadvantage as well, and the Byzantine Empire has many. The size of the empire itself works against it in many ways. It's burdened with a lot of administrative expenses. It's awfully expensive just to be the Byzantine Empire. There's an awful lot of territories, a lot to administer. Also, because it covers a huge geographic region, your authority, another concept we'll come back to any number of times over the day. Your authority is imposing your authority from your comfortable seat in Constantinople on the furthest reaches of Asia Minor can be very difficult indeed. Also, geography is destiny to some degree. You have some pretty aggressive neighbours, and Constantinople is a great prize.
Thankfully, you have some neat tools to deal with all these hindrances. For instance, you have the pronoia. What is the pronoia, Neil?
So pronoia is the ability to grant some of your enormous amounts of land to, say, your generals or other sort of veterans, senior peers, and that gives them administrative bonuses in the region, increases your authority, and crucially reduces some of the just day-to-day running costs of your enormous empire, so it can make a real difference.
This is unique to the Byzantine Empire. It's
Indeed,
a feature
yes.
unique to them.
Yeah.
Another unique feature that the Byzantine Empire has is the unique succession type they have. They're not tied to primogeniture.
Indeed, they have a very enlightened succession system, more so than the kind of remaining monarchies in Europe today, I think, in many ways. So it's not just your youngest, or your eldest son rather, who will automatically take over, but it's the most able member of the court who will ascend to the throne. Now, this is, in theory, a great thing for your empire, because instead of your eldest son automatically taking over, the most capable administrator, the most capable ruler will. However, that means there are lots of people who are competing for that role. It puts an enormous strain on your authority, and there will be a lot of unhappy noblemen when the most able candidate is chosen. There will be it will create lots of tensions and disloyalty within your court.
Meritocracy comes with its own price, I guess.
Indeed it does, and we'll come back to this later on, but a stable dynasty and a stable process of succession is vitally important to produce a winning score at the end of the game.
Yeah. Also, the Byzantine Empire has a an upgraded justice system, which in the game is represented as a specific unique type of stewardship buildings that only the Byzantines can build in their provinces.
Indeed, stewardship is how effectively your authority can be applied. It's one of the numerous currencies in the game that you will have to juggle, and the very enlightened system of Byzantium opens a number of buildings up to you that are not available to other nations and are unique to Byzantium.
The Byzantine Empire also has a set of missions which essentially will push them towards recovering the lost lands of the Roman Empire and progressing what was historically known as the Macedonian Restoration, a period of renaissance for the Eastern Roman Empire. And in the game, you're able to continue doing that. Historically, the Byzantine Empire suffered after Manzikert, which is shortly after the game start, but who knows, maybe you can turn things around in the Glory Kingdoms.
Indeed, it's not easy to do that by any means. It is a considerable challenge to hang on long enough to be able to implement those. But if you are a skilled enough ruler to do that, then late game, you can really see the benefits of that. But yeah, it's a big challenge to get there.
And we were talking of the largest country in the game, probably the most cumbersome one, and now we're switching to the second example of the day, which is maybe one of the tiniest country in the game.
Absolutely, almost the polar opposite, and
yes.
A certain amount of coming full circle, given that we announced the game in Venice.
Yes.
Our second territory is Venice.
Very ironic. So yeah, we have a clip featuring Venice. Venice is a maritime republic. It's not the only maritime republic in the game. There's also Pisa, Amalfi, Genoa. They're all based in Italy, and they're all city-states which rely on international trade and sea trade in order to fund their economy.
Indeed, as Venice, you occupy a very small geographical area, and you can't conquer all of northern Italy and go north of the Alps and have all this enormous amount of territory. It's just not possible. You have to focus on what you are able to do, which is, instead of raising men and manpower, as some other nations do, is to focus on your abilities as a seafaring nation and as a trading nation. The way that you win the game as Venice and establish legacy is just to be rich, rich, rich.
And how do you make money? There is a specific building type that you can build, but you can do so abroad.
Indeed, and they're almost like embassies, I suppose, overseas trade embassies called fondaki, which any of the maritime republics can build. You want to put them obviously somewhere rich. There's no point in having them in some sort of dusty, far-flung coast. So for Venice in particular, on this side of Italy, Byzantium seems like an obvious place to start establishing these territories that they will bring in money for you. There indeed is Byzantium.
There is a cost though, because if you keep building fondaki in the same country, there is a diminishing return because your costs keep rising. Also, if you put all your eggs in one basket, essentially you're risking a lot because the host country might decide that it's easier to seize your properties in order to basically to make a quick buck.
Absolutely, there's no such thing as a consequence-free decision in kingdoms or an easy decision to make if you keep building these. We've already established that Byzantium is going to be constantly at war. So if you've got all these rich embassies just lying there full of gold that could be paying for mercenaries, then unless you have a very strong relationship with Byzantium that goes beyond simple trade, then you could well find your easy pickings of all your fondaki along the Byzantine coast get plundered by Constantinople and used to fund the war to the east.
Obviously, as a maritime republic, you will be competing against the other maritime republic. So essentially, you're competing versus other countries which are doing the same thing as you are. So expect them to be very competitive and try to steal the terror in the
Yes,
sun.
indeed. I mean, they all suffer from the same constraints as you do. So it won't be too long before you find that you're trying to put fondaki in the same place that Genoa, for example, is. And you're soon going to need to put all those all that lovely gold to use in building warships and
recruiting mercenaries.
Well, yes, you don't have the manpower to raise an army, so it has to be mercenaries whose loyalty is never quite assured, of course. But
yeah, also playing as Venice as the other republics feels a lot like a Cloak and Dagger game as well.
Well, yes, indeed. Sort of medieval Italy, I think, is a byword for intrigue, and the maritime republics, in particular, have a number of decisions which are unique to them, where you can almost play sneak attacks against your rivals, try and assassinate a ruler or influence somebody unduly. Now, of course, even as Venice, you are not the only one who is as cunning as this, and you need to be very wary that they're not trying to do the same things to you.
Yeah. We come full circle because in the third clip and the third example that we're going to show you, we are going to feature the biggest rival to the Byzantine Empire, the Seljuk Turks. So in this clip, we're going to see the starting position of the Seljuks. So what can you tell us about the Seljuk Turks in Field of Glory Kingdoms now?
Well, we said that the empire, the Byzantine Empire, was weak, and as if you're playing as the Seljuks, it is very much your job to exploit that. You have a number of decisions. We're seeing some examples on the screen here at the moment, which you can use to influence governors and rulers in the easternmost parts of the empire to sow disrest. Their loyalty to Constantinople is far from assured. You have a powerful military, of course. We can see the shaded areas here, which are recently conquered areas by the Seljuks. So yeah, you have some tricks to play against a quite weak opponent in many ways. So as Byzantium has special gameplay targeted missions, essentially, that it needs to achieve in order to level up, so too do the Seljuks. But this time you're playing against the Byzantium, so you have very kind of clashing objectives.
Historically, the Seljuks were able to defeat the Byzantine Empire, conquer huge swathes of land in the eastern fringes of the empire, especially after the Battle of Manzikert, which, by the way, is one of the available scenarios in the game. The Seljuks have specific perks that help them win against the Byzantines. This might feel a bit rewarded, but it's the game's way to represent a geopolitical reality of the time. And since the game is about historically accuracy, we wanted it to be there. So it's
I always like to say that we're guided by history, and
yes.
it obviously it informs the events that take place in the game, but we're not bound by it. You know, history is not destiny in our game. There are, in fact, a couple of specific events you can choose to turn off, namely the Norman invasion of England. You can ensure that never happens, and what an idea that is. And also our Crusader-related events, yes, another thing we will come to later on.
That's awesome. Okay, so these were just 3 examples of the unique flavor that we are giving to some specific countries in the game. But now we want to move on to one major core concept in the game: authority. We already mentioned authority previously, but Neil, now we really want to deep dive into it. So what is authority, and what does it mean to have authority in Field of Glory Kingdoms? Also, we have a clip to feature authority as well.
Well, I've been surprised that we've managed to get this far and only mention authority once or twice, because it really is the lifeblood of everything that you do in Kingdoms. Although legacy points determine who wins the game, ultimately, authority is your day-to-day, and it governs almost everything. We're seeing, for example, there a dynasty screen, so the strength of your authority governs the loyalty of your other nobles to you. It governs how likely it is that your chosen heir or your anointed heir will succeed you when the time comes. It governs, as we're seeing here, the type of your kingdom and your ability to ascend to the next level of government, and therefore grow your kingdom and grow your dynasty and acquire legacy points and so on and so forth.
It also represents how respected your kingdom is by your peers. For instance, during a typical Let's Play of Field of Glory Kingdoms, you will get claims on neighboring countries representing your historical claims as a faction, as a power. If you're able to enforce those claims and win them in a war, you will gain authority. But if you do invade your neighbors without such claims, you will lose authority.
Indeed, yeah, we're seeing Scotland on screen at the moment, and of course 2 neighbouring countries that spent a lot of time invading each other. You can't really just march your troops into another territory. That's not how it works. You have to have claims. Claims get established over time, partially because of the authority of the rulers. Almost by default, that will lead to claims on neighbouring nations. The more authoritative you are, the more authority you have, the more other nations will look the other way when you invade, the more likely they will be to support you. If you have weak authority and you get invaded, then nobody's going to care. Nobody's going to come to your rescue. You've got weak authority. Why would they care?
Yeah, since you were mentioning dynasty trees, how does authority affect the relationship between your dynasty members, your heir? What's in role there? What's in play there?
You're only really assured of the loyalty of your infant children. And beyond that, the rest of your court is the kind of hotbed of intrigue that you might imagine in medieval times. You have a number of you have relations, you have a wife. Poor old Erling here doesn't have any courtesans, but most rulers will have several courtesans as well. They will have children. But also at court there are clergy and there are generals and there are other noblemen as well. And they all have their ambitions. We could see the treasury overlay there, so that they have their own personal wealth and so on and so forth. So the more authority you have, the more control you have over that. A weak leader is susceptible to being replaced both from without, from neighbouring nations are much more likely to try and depose you and take your lands, but also from within as well. Those peers will have designs on the throne, on the crown, or whatever it is, depending on the form of government you have, if your authority is weak.
Since you mentioned loyalty, which is obviously tied to authority as well, I just wanted to mention that loyalty of specific characters is not something that is immediately visible to the player.
No, indeed. When you start the game, I did mention that only your infant children really, only their loyalty are you assured of. The peers themselves, you've got no real idea. Over several years, that will reveal itself, much as you would expect in real life. But you might not have several years. The clock is always ticking when you're on the throne. So there are a number of decisions you can play. You can spy on people, for example, to see what their loyalty is, and various other tricks to sort of reveal their loyalty and flush it out. But there are also clues as well you can be looking for. Perhaps one of the most obvious things you can look for in a peer is somebody who has a very large treasury, because of course a large treasury could play for lots of mercenaries or a bigger standing army of his own, for example. So
and maybe they just mean they're embezzling money from the treasury.
Well, exactly, and they do embezzle money. So and there are characteristics. There are many more characteristics in the court this time for any individual. So yeah, there are a few that involve peers who like to keep a little bit of cash for themselves, and it's worth keeping a very close eye on them.
Thankfully, you have some tools to deal with that, like for instance, embezzlement trials or witchcraft trials.
Indeed, all of your peers have personal ratings for administration, military, and piety. Yes, another thing we'll come to later. So if they are low in, well, particularly administration, then embezzlement trial could be an ideal way to prosecute them. If their personal piety is low, then yeah, put them on trial for witchcraft and see them deal with that, and perhaps that will help with their loyalty. There are other things you can do as well. You can send them on a suicide mission, send them to face the Seljuk Turks or something like that, and see how much they like that. But it's not guaranteed that they will fall on the battlefield by any means. They may escape, they may even win. You never know.
All right, so amazing. Let's move on to another key concept in Field of Glory Kingdoms, vassals and feudalism. So vassals are something you can't really do without in Field of Glory Kingdoms. Most countries, as you play as them, you will be forced to have vassals because that's just the reality of the time. So let's start and watch this new clip featuring vassals. Vassals are essentially semi-autonomous provinces or factions tied to you and swearing allegiance to you.
Indeed, you can, I mean, we don't even get to touch on this today, but you can create regions, or provinces rather, a grouping of regions within your empire. But you can also create vassals as well, which, as you say, have a much higher level of autonomy. You don't get to control everything that they do. They will remit some of their gold to you, and you can, I think, pretty much demand their troops in times of war. So why would you cut off a large part of your empire and remove it from your direct control?
Good question.
The answer to that is, and it goes back to our central concept of authority, the more that your empire grows geographically in most gameplay terms, obviously not in Venice, so, the more it grows geographically, the more that your authority will be stretched. And it will be quite hard to evolve your government to a superior level by organically trying to balance your authority and the size of your domain. So the best way to allow an increased size in domain that allows you to level up is to create vassals and maybe take some of those troublesome peers and cut them loose from the court and put them in charge of the vassals. They can go off and do their own thing. It doesn't count to your, it doesn't count against your authority, but it does count towards your domain size. So it's sort of free territory in a sense, but in what is already becoming a recurring theme, of course, that doesn't come without problems either.
I think that's great because in the time frame that is featured in the game, the historical process was one of centralization. You will see these countries essentially absorbing these vassals, like it happened with France or England.
Yes, indeed. When you start playing the game as France, for example, France is a pretty small island within what we now know as France. You know, hence Île-de-France is a very small area, and you have nominal vassals that are much bigger and in many ways, in fact, much more powerful than the Kingdom of France. So, you know, who ascends to pull all of France together and who becomes the true leader of France? I mean, as leader of any of those vassals, you can end up as the King of France yourself, which is a gameplay feature we've spoken about before. But England as well, again, you will start with many vassals, and as you absorb them back into your kingdom at some stage and evolve, that's when they do become useful. But disloyal vassal leaders can, of course, cause you many problems. They have an army, they have a treasury, they have their own ambitions. So, yeah, you need to be careful who's in charge of your vassals and keep a close eye on them and what you demand from them as well. You find, like, squabbling children almost sometimes. If you have 7 or 8 vassals all under your control, they might all want the same thing. They might all want a load of money from you, or metal or manpower to fight a war, and you can't keep them all happy. And you know, somebody's happiness is always going to be somebody else's disappointment. So, yeah, it's a good way to increase the size of your kingdom, but as with everything else, there are some hard choices. It comes at a price, yes.
Okay, so moving on to the next topic, religion. So there are, first of all, let's start with the clip because it's a long one. There are 2 main religion groups in Field of Glory Kingdoms. I'm talking, of course, of Christianity and Islam. They have their own subtypes, of course. With Christianity, obviously, It's mostly Catholicism and the Eastern Church, because the game just starts after the Great Schism.
Indeed, it's the foundational event of our game.
And but there are heresies as well, of course. There's Judaism as well. As for Islam, the main groups are, of course, Sunni Islam and Shia Islam. And of course, this leads to a lot of religious tension and religious warfare.
Indeed. Christian and Muslim neighbours' relationships are
rocky.
Yes, they are, and unfortunately it's destiny, really. Christian and Muslim neighbours, their relationships will deteriorate over time. There will be claims on each other's territory, so you are almost fated never to get along. I think the challenge playing as Muslim nations as well is there's a particular tension between sort of Sunni and Shia and competing for control of the holy sites of Islam. We also have, which we didn't mention a moment ago, pagans as well. Mm-hmm. There are any number of pagan sects dotted around on that map. Indeed, Scotland and Ireland seem like the kind of places where you will have pagan sects lying around. So yeah, these guys have no faith at all, certainly, which means as a Christian nation you are pretty much free to wage war on them. It won't cost you any authority because nobody cares about the pagan guys in particular.
Earlier you mentioned a concept or a currency, let's say, called piety. So what can you tell us about piety in Feudal Kingdoms?
Yeah, piety is one of the many currencies in the game, and it is important that you have good piety within your whole empire, for any number of reasons. Spiritual health of the people is just generally good. I mean, people with poor religion, poor spiritual health, it will challenge your authority. There is the risk of heresies breaking out, and that they spread almost like diseases within the game. So you spend a lot of time fighting heresies. It diminishes your authority if you're in charge of a big bunch of heretics and you can't even bring that under control. So we have clerics as a population class that we will see in the sort of building and population menus from time to time. So it's very important to build religious structures within your lands.
Speaking of holy wars, I just wanted to touch upon the topic of crusades and jihads, which are tied to piety as a mechanic. Because the way it works is that Pope will give the most pious character or ruler from the Christian side the option to choose the target region for the crusade. Well, obviously, it will be mostly gravitating around the holy sites of Jerusalem or the Holy Land in general. But if you want, you can also opt to go for another type of target. And when a crusade is launched, any Christian country can decide to opt in and take part into it, as we're seeing in screen right now.
Indeed, yes. Good piety is also essential for having good relationships with the papacy, which as a Christian nation it is always going to be in your better interests to have a strong relationship with the well, as a Western Christian nation, of course, at least, having strong relationships with the papacy. Joining crusades will improve your relationship with the papacy, but also with your co-combatants. It will help you build relationships with them as you say, generally, obviously you are campaigning in the Holy Land. It comes at a cost as well, of course. Sort of committing good quality units to fight all the way in the Holy Land is expensive.
Speaking of which, what we're seeing now is the Dukedom of Tripoli, which is, if I remember correctly, it's a splinter Crusader state, fighting against the Fatimids. This is, just want to explain what's happening here on screen. It's the automatic battle solver.
Indeed, you don't wage war within Fog Kingdoms. The battles are essentially predetermined in terms of your strength, but also the general ship skills of your general, if you have a general in charge of your troops, his loyalty to you, etc., the terrain on which you're fighting. But what you're watching there is essentially an abstraction of how the battle plays out based on those values. So it's sort of the standard Fog Kingdoms battle module is what we were seeing there.
Now on screen we're seeing a decision to found the Holy Order, and we were seeing the Knight Templars just a few seconds before. So Holy Orders, what are they and what role do they play in Field of Glory Kingdoms?
So we have 5 Holy Orders in the game. It seems almost disrespectful to describe them as NPCs, but there are numerous Holy Orders roaming the lands who do not belong to any nation. They can be very strong allies, particularly in times of a crusade. They are sort of well-trained, very experienced knightly troops. But they answer to nobody but God, and you are not God. So you can find them also setting up in your territory and building buildings in your territory and expecting you to pay for them, and they can be sometimes very reluctant guests to leave, and they can be quite hard to make leave as well. So you know, once again, they are something which, under the right circumstances, is a very powerful asset to a player, and in times of war, very, very useful, but they can outstay their welcome, certainly. So
we have a new clip featuring what's fun to do in peacetime, and that is handling your economy. There's a very deep economical system which is relying on so many building types. How many do we have? I believe over 600, right?
It's about 600 building types, yes. And what types are available to you depend on your culture, whether Christian, Muslim, or pagans. They all have their own buildings based on the technologies that those religions or absence thereof controlled at the time, but also where you are geographically, your type of government, the authority that you have. Fully 1/3 of the buildings overall have unique properties as well. They're all closely matched to the cultures which they serve. So, you know, we don't just have a farm which is the same in Antioch as it is in Ireland. Everything is closely matched to its appropriate territory. We're just seeing here on the Isle of Man, for example, what you can build.
I really love how so many building types in this game have unique events associated to them.
Indeed, there are so many that do give you powerful opportunities. We were talking about Venice, for example, earlier, and we never mentioned the Arsenale and sort of the powerful things that it allows you to do militarily and what it can help you build. They open up regional decisions to you, which again we haven't really dived into, but these are almost cards which are given to you at the start of a turn that you can play. We talked about assassinating nobles or investigating them. You know, that would be off the basis of a regional decision, but there are so many more things you can do with them depending on what buildings you have. We're seeing, for example, sort of glass blowers there.
Farmer's market.
Yeah, farmer's market. Yes, that's.
Historically, in this era, you will see some building types taking so many generations in order to be built, like I'm thinking cathedrals or castles, and that is something that is actually represented in the game, because there's something called a modular approach to building or to constructing this type of buildings.
Indeed, I mean, these buildings could take 40 or 50 years to build. I mean, that's 100 turns. It will tie up an awful lot of your manpower and your metal and your resources, and it doesn't make for a particularly fun experience if you have to wait for 4 hours of gameplay before it's built. So in keeping with it, with times you can build, and depending on your technologies, you can build buildings in a relatively sort of modular fashion, so they're functional from a much earlier stage, such as particularly with military buildings, which we'll come on to in a bit. Yeah, you know, you can build a sort of smaller force and then start building walls and ramparts and moats around that as well. So.
Another fascinating aspect of how the economy works in Field of Glory Kingdoms is the fact that buildings and production processes are deeply tied to or deeply connected to population and specific population classes and resource types.
Indeed, yes. We can see on screen here down at the bottom are 6 different types of buildings. So we have agriculture. Clearly, there's no place for that in Baghdad. A number of infrastructure buildings below there. Commercial on the bottom of the left. Then on the right-hand side, military in red, piety buildings in the middle, we're not seeing any there. And then at the bottom are stewardship buildings, which you would appoint nobles to control, and that helps with your authority in any territory. So we have 4 population classes overall versus 2 in empires. It's not the age of social mobility. You can't be born a peasant and end up a bishop. But you might be able to move to be a free man and work in commerce or something like that. As your population grows, you will be granted more population, allowing you to grow further. It depends on your infrastructure, your members, and food as well. I mean, you can't grow without food and infrastructure. And generally, your new population will be allocated proportionally.
Yeah, and basically as these population groups take part in production processes, they produce resource types, and I believe there's 60 different resource types.
Something like 60 different resource types in total.
Yeah, as we're seeing now.
Yes.
Actually, from this screen, we're seeing the trade routes trading these resources across the North Sea.
Indeed, yes. Yes, somebody must have extraordinarily good trading skills there, because trade is something which is more or less automated in this game. We didn't want to make it a micromanaging click fest of sort of click here to send vegetables there and then send some leather to there and beeswax. And just you end up spending all your time doing that rather than focusing on sort of what is fun in the game. So it's all automated now. It depends on buildings and what they produce. We've changed the way that goods produce service in Empire, so you can't just have one say tin mine that's servicing the whole Byzantium nowadays. You'll need more than that certainly to satisfy all the needs of a large empire like that. So a number of refinements have come in from empires. You will trade automatically at distance, depending, as always, on authority, but also your diplomatic relations with other nations, and whether you have commercial ports, for example, talking about buildings giving specific perks. And we saw the Isle of Man there a minute ago, and their ability to trade is obviously dependent on having the right ports in place.
But enough about peacetime. I believe that we want to move on to the topic of war and to the next clip, because we want to show how to wage war and what kind of unit types you have in order to wage war. So there are 3 major, let's say, unit types. That those are levies, mercenaries, and standing army units.
Indeed, we've tried to be guided by how it worked in those times, of course. Your standing armies are your elite troops, if you
your
like.
professionals.
Indeed, yes. Professional soldiers, expensive to raise, expensive to less expensive to maintain it, but very expensive to raise, certainly. Lots of turns, you need lots of resources. They do still cost you in upkeep as they sit around. The plus side for them is that they are powerful, of course. They are much more effective in battle. They are the backbone of your army.
Yeah, for instance, earlier, since we were talking of the Byzantine Empire, the Varangian Guard as serving the emperor of the Byzantine Empire is a perfect example of a standing army of the time. So what about levies?
Sort of the last point really with your standing units is they gain experience over time as well in battle, which leads us on to levies, who are in many ways the opposite of all those things about your sort of your elite troops. They are the peasantry of the land. They can be raised quite quickly. They have not no skill, but they are your numerous infantry troops who can be sort of sent into battle. There's no great loss of authority if they die, whereas you do lose authority if you manage to lose a number of your sort of standing army troops.
Essentially cannon fodder, before cannons.
Cannon fodder before cannon fodder, yes. So whatever it will be in those arrow fodder or something like that. Yes.
I like the term arrow fodder.
Yes. Yeah, they can easily be raised. They don't gain experience. They do need feeding and stuff. So there's no point in keeping them hanging around after they've done what you need them to do.
And what about mercenaries?
Mercenaries are sort of fairly self-explanatory, really. They cost only gold to raise, whereas other troops will need manpower, metals, equipment, what have you. Whereas mercenaries will purely do it for the money. They have obviously no particular loyalty to you, so it depends what general you have in charge. With perfect timing, there is General Pocus on the screen in charge of the Masovian army.
Yeah, as you can see, we're talking of the 3 different group types of different unit types, but of course each culture has their own specific actual type of units from the era. Also something I wanted to mention quite briefly, you have to be wary of where you disband your troops in Field of Glory Kingdoms.
Indeed, if you get a load of dirty peasants and you give them weapons and you hike them up into fighting war, and then you say, it's fine, just nothing. They're going to find something to do, and they're aggressive, and they've got weapons and they've got nothing else to do.
Yeah, and they start to be unemployed as well.
So you need to be very careful about where you disband them. Wherever possible, you should disband them in some other empire rather than your own, because they can turn to banditry and robbery, and they can be quite a problem, in fact. So it's not just you want to disband them wherever you can. You can obviously use that as quite a strategic decision if you're bringing your troops home from an overseas war, about where you choose to disband them and unleash hell.
It's never fun to have a marauding army of bandits in your own provinces. So earlier we mentioned that in Field of Glory Kingdoms you solve your battles automatically, but that doesn't have to be the case, as shown in the next clip. Because in Field of Glory Kingdoms, much like Field of Glory Empires, you can import your battle to Field of Glory Medieval.
Absolutely. It was a feature that we first implemented in Empires quite a long way after release. So we sort of retrofitted it into the game, but it's proven very popular with players, and indeed within an hour of seeing the game release today, I'm seeing people talking about it on Steam forums again. So we had to abstract certain things last time around just to make the different troop types all match up, because it wasn't designed that way. Kingdoms has been designed from the ground up so that every unit in the game matches something which is already there in Fog 2 Medieval. So it works much better. I myself am much more of a Venice player, I think, than a Seljuk Turk kind of guy. I prefer the trading side of things, and I'm less interested in the combat, but obviously lots of people don't play these games that way. They're not really designed to be played that way in many ways. So combat is an important part of it, and for those who want to who fancy themselves better as generals and able to turn the tide of history, and more concerned about where each unit goes, and it's all these very war game things about points of advantage and zones of control, and feels comfortable dealing with that kind of level of detail, then they are free to do that. And yes, export the battle in. So Kingdoms doesn't roll the dice and predetermine your result. It's only what happens under your control in Field of Glory Medieval that determines how the battle is resolved. So works much better than it did in Empires. As I say, it's been designed from the ground up, so 1 for 1 in terms of units.
So since we're talking about war, I wanted to touch upon the topic of what is essentially the endgame boss of the game, as shown in the next clip, the Mongols.
Indeed, yes. If you are, I think particularly the Rus are vulnerable, then towards the later period of the game, the late 13th century, then the Mongol horde is going to be coming for you, and how you manage that is going to determine how you win the game. They are fast and they are powerful, and they do not stop around to establish grain farms or blacksmiths or anything like that. They're just moving on to the next conquest. So resisting them militarily is going to be very difficult, certainly. It's going to be very much a test of your generalship skills. Certainly when we've run AI-only games in testing, they've reached as far as Poland even, so they've steamrolled all the way through the Rus. So they're a powerful, formidable foe, and another example of sort of unique gameplay type. Although the Mongols themselves, because they're not especially interesting to play, because you're not really building an empire there. You're
Besides,
just
they only arrive by the late
exactly,
era.
yeah. There'd be sort of 200 years of not very much of interest, really. Yeah, it's a nice surprise for our players in sort of in Eastern Europe towards the end of the game.
So this concludes our presentation for today, and I'm really looking forward to facing the Mongols in Field of Glory Kingdoms. We want to thank you, everyone, for following us here today. I just wanted to remind you all that if you already own Field of Glory 2 Medieval, there is a quite nice bundle.
Yeah, there's a very good discount.
Yes, 25% off, if I remember correctly. So if you do own Field of Glory 2 Medieval on Steam, feel free to acquire Field of Glory Kingdoms through the bundle and enjoy the discount. So it's been a real pleasure to have you here with us today, and we hope that you will enjoy Field of Glory Kingdoms. But if you want to see more of Field of Glory Kingdoms, we'll have a stream starting soon featuring Richard York playing the game.